Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the last of the feedback loops for the Western Sydney co-design process for the local safe haven. We really appreciate you joining us today, and if you're watching us and watching it through the recording, thank you for taking the time to look at what has been happening in Western Sydney during this co-design. I might just introduce myself. My name's Tina. I'm one of the facilitators with Roses in the Ocean. I've been doing a lot of the facilitation for these co-design processes.
And hi, I'm Carrie Lumby, and I'm part of the Roses in the Ocean facilitation team, particularly around co-design like Tina.
Cool. So I'm just going to share my screen now. We're going to take you through some slides today that summarise the information that's been shared with us by people in Western Sydney. And also we'll tell you a little bit about the process so far and what's going to happen after this. So we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and traditional custodians of all of the lands that we're located on today. When we're joining something like this online, we tend to be located on many different lands, but in particular, we'd like to acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the land where the safe haven in Western Sydney is going to be set up. And we'd like to pay our respects to Darug elders, past and elders present, as well as the young people who'll be the elders of the future. We'd also like to acknowledge anybody who's joining us today who has a lived experience of suicide, and we'd like to acknowledge the special expertise that is brought to this co-design process by people who have a lived experience of suicide. And that includes people who have really struggled with thoughts of suicide in the past or survived a suicide attempt, people who today are struggling with finding a reason to live, people who have cared for someone who has been in a suicidal crisis, and people who have been bereaved through suicide. And we in particular appreciate all that people with lived experience have contributed to this process, including health professionals who have a lived experience and the special knowledge that health professionals have through working with people who have experienced suicidal crisis. So we are now coming to the end of what's been quite a long process. The diagram you can see on the left there is summarising the whole journey that we've been through with people in Western Sydney. So we started by having conversations with people who have a lived experience of suicide, and then separately having conversations with people who are health professionals in Western Sydney. And after having a number of these conversations that really explored people's experiences during traditional approaches to seeking help during a suicidal crisis through the emergency department. And then we looked at the needs that are being met and that are not being met in the current system, and explored ways that the safe haven might be able to meet the needs of everyone. So people who are experiencing a suicidal crisis, but also we needed to discuss how it is that health professionals in the area could feel comfortable and confident in supporting people to attend the new safe space and the new safe haven. So after having these separate conversations, last Tuesday, we brought everybody together and we had these fantastic conversations with half the participants were people with lived experience of suicide, and half the participants were health professionals from the Western Sydney region. And what we did is we explored a whole lot of real life scenarios that could come up in the safe haven, and used those to really explore how things will be done, what sorts of principles will be followed, and what's important to people in this new safe haven that's being set up. So the purpose of what we're doing today is to report back to you all of this information that we've been shared from people in Western Sydney and make sure that everyone in the community has access to the information that's been provided to us during the consultations of this co-design process. And it's an opportunity for people who have been involved in the process to add any extra ideas that they might have had since the conversations that we had in our co-design sessions, but also an opportunity for people that weren't involved in those conversations to share their perspectives. And we really encourage you to share the link at the end of this webinar to the survey. Share that as widely as possible. Share it with people who have lived experience, people who are health professionals, so that we can really gain the perspectives of as many people as possible on what people would like to see in this new safe haven in Western Sydney. So the first thing that we're going to do today is I'm going to share with you the feedback that we got after our last webinar. So the last webinar that we shared with you was after we'd finished having those separate meetings with people with lived experience and with health professionals. And what we're going to present to you now is the additional perspectives that were shared with us after people watched this webinar. We're not going to present all of the information on these slides. If you are watching this live, please, we invite you to click on the survey link and you will find the slides are actually printed in the survey, and you can read through all of the information that's provided when you open up the survey. We're just going to highlight a few points here. If you're watching the recording of this webinar, you can pause the recording and have a read of some of the other ideas that were shared with us in response to the survey. So in the survey, we had 5 people with lived experience from Western Sydney respond to the survey, and we had 4 health professionals in Western Sydney respond to the survey. So in terms of the lived experience perspectives that were shared with us, lived experience people did mostly agree with the findings that were presented from the co-design sessions. One respondent strongly disagreed with the idea of involuntary measures being used in the safe haven, saying that they felt that that was particularly unhelpful for consumers. But just a few comments that were made during that. One person commented, "I believe police involvement should be very limited and only initiated in extreme circumstances." Another person said that paperwork should be kept to an absolute minimum so the process doesn't get bogged down in filing. And there were also some comments on practical elements, the idea that maybe there should be a second site in the Mount Druitt or Blacktown area, and also that, you know, practical things like it needs to be accessible, convenient, and there needs to be free parking for guests. Some other perspectives that were presented to us by the lived experience respondents in that feedback were that they considered the promotion of the service to be really, really important. There was some disagreement with the health professional perspective that there should be robust clinical assessment, and it was proposed by that respondents that assessments be non-clinical in nature. And also, there were a range of views presented on how support should be offered to family members, carers, people who were supporting the person in crisis. So just a few quotes from those responses. There was a comment that promotion needs to target priority populations, and it's important to connect to and promote with the adjacent LHD safe havens. There were also comments about promoting the safe havens with GPs, that it could be advertised in the emergency department, and that perhaps that information needs to be translated into a number of languages. Particularly important in the Western Sydney area is this idea of spirituality. And one of the quotes from the respondents to the survey was, "Spirituality is very important. Perhaps a safe haven could refer to alternative treatments such as attending church or a Buddhist retreat." There was mixed responses in the lived experience respondents to the survey about the idea of using volunteers in the safe haven. This is something we've explored further in the last session of the co-design process. And also what was raised was the idea that people in the safe haven, even if they're not maybe falling under the Mental Health Act, that they at least need to have knowledge around that. And I'll just read you a couple of the quotes that were shared around this. One person said, "I don't think that peer support workers should be hired on a volunteer basis, as I feel as though that would be a form of tokenism." But then there was a different point of view. The use of volunteers is a good alternative if funding is not there for more peer workers, but they need to be provided appropriate training. So what you see on this slide here are the feedback we received from health professionals in Western Sydney on the information that had been captured in the co-design process so far. And health professionals mostly agreed with the findings that were captured in that process. There were strong themes from health professionals and suggestions regarding risk management, essential skills for staff, and follow-up with clients. And there was, with one respondent, strong disagreement with the idea of a clinical assessment process taking place in the safe haven. So just a couple of the quotes from that feedback, and you can certainly, like I said, read these in the survey, or you can pause and read all of the quotes while you're watching the recording. So there's a strong view that's really represented in this quote, that risk assessments and safe work practice need to be completed in order to mitigate risk. Another comment was that safe haven sites should be alarmed to reach either a security guard or first responders. But then an alternative point of view, you can see down the bottom here. I do not agree with the need to have clinical assessment processes taking place with the alternative to ED. If consumers express a desire to be linked with clinical services, this should be catered for, but only when requested. So as you can see, we're gathering a range of perspectives here, and we really encourage people to provide us their perspective in the survey that we'll give you the link for at the end of this webinar. Just a little bit more information on those health professional responses. There was doubt raised about the ability of the staff allocation to meet the needs of the safe haven. So that's an allocation of 2 full-time equivalent SP peer workers. And one health professional acknowledged that paperwork is not the ideal way of communicating, but it is important for medico-legal, governance and education perspectives. So a few quotes on this. So one thing that was raised by a health professional was visual aids around the entrance and environment to allow for identification of minorities such as the LGBTI First Nations communities. There were comments about needing a sensory room, also that the alternative to ED should have a close working relationship with existing mental health clinicians working out of the emergency department so that they could support a warm referral. So I'm going to hand over to Carrie now, and Carrie is going to take you through what came out of the conversations we had in that 4.5-hour session we had with people with lived experience and health professionals together in the same room, exploring a whole lot of scenarios that might come up in the safe haven.
Thanks very much, Tina. Yeah, we've just had that session, and it was a fantastic, I thought it was a fantastic session, really, really productive, seeing people with lived experience and health professionals really working in equal partnership to start to test the values and principles of the safe space service model in relation to some of these, more complex scenarios you'll see as we work through them at times, really sort of sometimes test up against the limits of that, of risk tolerance, of it being a non-clinical service that is staffed by peer workers. So as you'll be able to see as we work through this, there was some really great work that was done in order to work out how the local safe haven will be able to hold itself to those values and principles. Thanks, Tina. So scenario one was, and I'll just read this out to people. Chantel is a 17-year-old teenage girl who arrives at the safe space experiencing suicidal thoughts. It is the first time she's ever reached out for help, and she's frightened by what she's experiencing. She doesn't know where else to go. It is 30 minutes before closing time. Thanks, Tina. So the purpose of this one, of this scenario, was to really consider how the no wrong door approach, which is required by these services, how the local safe haven will support young people who turn up seeking help, and hold to that no wrong door approach. Also, given that the local safe haven can't be open 24/7 at this point, at least, what processes could be developed to support guests seeking help near closing time, and also to consider what are some of the ways the specialist peer workers that have been employed for this service could provide support to guests outside of opening hours if that was needed. Thanks, Tina. So some of the, we've just got a summary here, but a pretty detailed one of how the co-design participants responded to this scenario. First, we heard very loud and clear that it's about building trust with Chantel. So recognition that Chantel is reaching out for the first time, and that's a critical moment in her recovery or her potential to be put on a path to recovery, and that she's also to emphasize that it was said in the scenario she's frightened. So to recognize that, to welcome her and make her feel safe, to support her initially just to unpack these emotions, and then perhaps to provide some education around other services that might be able to support her, as well as empowering her to support herself. So recognizing that she might already have natural supports and coping strategies that she can harness. Recognition that the space has a stabilizing purpose in that moment, but also to reassure her that she can attend again the next day, and that safety planning could be done in a non-clinical way, and that it's more about the approach to that conversation than the tool itself that's used, and potentially to match, if possible, a peer worker with Chantel around the issue of sort of age and gender, specifically with Chantel, that may be a better match for her lived experience. Then also the fact that it's getting close to closing time. There's an acknowledgement that 30 minutes can be enough. It might be that it's therapeutic just for her to know that the space is there and to just be able to talk to someone for half an hour. And that also that at closing times the doors would need to close to new guests, but be able to stay the open for people to ensure that supports are in place for Chantel, so that peer workers need to have pre-approved overtime for when they're needing to do that, so they don't just cut people off that they're having conversations with. It also, someone suggested it needs to be evident when the space is closed, with the hours advertised and information and signage to indicate other supports being clearly highlighted and well lit. Services need to invest in building relationships with other services that are available 24/7, so that there are ways to warmly connect people. And also just an acknowledgement that Chantel can't just be told where to go and expected to just go there. There may be that there needs to be an exploration of how she got to the safe haven. She may not have access to transport, and there may be a need for safe haven to arrange transportation. Thanks, Tina. Also, in terms of planning for Chantel to be leaving the safe haven and follow up, when it's getting late, there needs to be a way to identify with the service coordinator that appropriate supports are in place, and also to make sure she does have literacy around what other supports are available and specifically what they do. Also to see, check in with her to see if the safe haven could follow up with her in the morning, either a phone or a text check-in it says here to make Chantel feel calm. To work with Chantel to set her up in a way to go home with a plan for what's next. Also to explore whether family is able to support her, but there was recognition that it could be the source of her distress, so just being able to explore that with her. And that she needs to be with someone she feels safe with. If someone doesn't exist in her own life and she continues to feel unsafe, that she may need to go to ED or be referred to ACT. And then in terms of her age, yes, again, it's that idea that there's a commitment to the no wrong door approach. The space needs to be open, available to anyone, including people under 18. Age is not an issue, shouldn't be an issue to accessing the service. But there was also a recognition that parental or guardian consent would be ideal, but it wouldn't turn a young person away. People also identified that there needs to be mindfulness around the risk and other applicable legislation and LHD policies with regard to people that are young people, including the Mental Health Act and Child Protection policy, and that these procedures need to sit behind and back up the support being offered rather than being front of mind and in the approach. And then there also needs to be, it needs to be made clear that services, the service does not fall under the Mental Health Act, but the principle of supporting someone in the least restrictive way is an important feature of the service. And if Chantel needs more help that can't be offered by the peer workers, it would be important to talk with her about how she would like to be connected with other options and to provide her with that opportunity for choice in that process. Thanks, Tina. Scenario 2 was Leanne walks into the safe haven. She knows the safe haven well, having visited for a few weeks in a row. She had previously told an SP peer worker that it's a place where she can relax for a while, knowing that she's safe from self-harming while she's there. Tonight, she appears to be intoxicated and quite agitated, that the peer worker who she now feels she can trust isn't available to speak with her. She's becoming quite loud and insistent, and another guest has indicated that it's making them uncomfortable. Thanks, Tina. So the prompting questions here are, given that the ministry's requirement that the safe haven adheres to a no wrong door principle, and that there is not the typical exclusion criteria that traditional services have, how will the local safe haven manage the issue of a potentially intoxicated guest? And then, given the ministry's requirement that safe havens take a trauma-informed, compassionate approach to supporting everyone who attends, how will the local safe haven support a guest whose distress presents as a guest aggression while keeping other guests safe and staff? Thanks, Tina. So the important thing that was emphasised was that Leanne must not feel judged, and that peer workers need to be able to speak compassionately and to really consider that their words and mannerisms have impact and they're not to contribute to her agitation, but also to understand that what's important is to be clear and upfront about what the rules, limitations and expectations are around the safe haven service. Perhaps what could happen is someone could be given a rundown of what they can expect if they come back to the service, if it's not a good fit for them at the time, perhaps a booklet or a pamphlet. Clear guidelines about the availability of peer workers given to guests, and working in a team approach to manage expectations and boundaries with guests that may present a more challenging, might present with more challenging behaviour. Acknowledge that it's important people don't develop a dependence on one worker. That was one perspective. A different perspective on that was that it was important feature of this service for people to have trust and be able to not have to retell their story. So that may mean that there might be some continuity, if that's possible, with a peer worker over time if someone comes to the service more than once. Also, again, people talking about holding to the no wrong door approach and making all guests feel welcome, and to take an opportunity to de-escalate agitation if and where possible, and not to be too quick to send people to ED or to escalate something to a crisis response, to honour the fact that people are trying to seek help and they have turned to this service to do so. To recognise also the link between intoxication and people who attempt suicide, that rising risk when there is those things coexisting, and that might mean that there have to be more other support or more intensive support are provided. And to recognise that there may be scenarios where the safe haven just simply is unable to support someone, and that may mean sending a person to ED to get medical treatment, for example, for intoxication, and that might be the best approach. And that Leanne's capacity to have a, sorry, Tina, yeah, thanks. Leanne's capacity to have a meaningful conversation just may not be there, her capacity may be diminished, and it might just be simply better to welcome her back later when she's able to have a meaningful conversation with a peer worker. Thanks, Tina. There was also a recognition that it's important to think about that the safe haven has to be a safe space for staff as well as guests. And while everyone is welcome, it can't be at the negative, it can't be at the risk of harm to other guests and staff. And there needs to be safety pathways to minimise risk while working with that person or connecting them with someone else. And that removing the person from other guests might be necessary to make others feel safe. There may be situations where services need to be in contact with the police, but there needs to be an understanding that needs to be worked out what the pathways are and how to prioritise those, and the fact that these should be used as a last resort. And also related to that is that escalation pathways could include existing co-responder models with ambulance and police that already exist in this LHD. Also, what was really did come out of the conversation was how important the layout of the space will be for being able to support everyone, and that is about planning a space, creating a space which is already some work and thinking around this has already been developed in the front yard where people can cool down, it was called, and speak with a peer worker outside, and then can be welcomed into the service once they are calm. Another intended feature of the physical space is breakout rooms with sensory objects where people can be separate from others and can sort of modulate their distress and their emotions, and also just flexibility with the space generally. So there are different zones to help manage these sometimes competing needs of guests, and to be able to have private conversations that are less likely to impact other guests. Record keeping just came out as a natural consequence of this conversation. So taking records was suggested as a way to enable information sharing between peer workers, and also would give the ability to support Leanne where she's been supported by someone else before. And then recording any notes should happen after visiting the safe haven. That was noted that while information sharing may be important, that it's also important not to be recording information while you're supporting someone like Leanne. Thanks, Tina. Third scenario is that David turns up at the safe haven for the first time. He seems quite agitated and distracted. He heard about the safe haven from a community services worker who supports him in a program for people with complex and enduring mental illness. He tells the peer worker that his neighbour is trying to control his thoughts through a chip he's planted in his television. David says he can't handle the torment of this anymore and feels that killing himself is the only way to get relief from it. Thanks, Tina. So the questions that sort of were framed the conversation around this was, given that the ministry requires that safe havens are non-clinical and will not provide clinical services, how will peer workers support guests who are experiencing suicidal distress that appears to be associated with a serious mental illness? And then how will peer workers support guests who disclose experiences like David, specifically within the space? Thanks, Tina. So here there was real agreement that regardless of the cause of someone's distress, that the important thing is that the service takes that no wrong door approach, takes that non-clinical and compassion focused approach, and that the person is in the right place to lower their feelings of distress in a non-clinical environment. Also, a real emphasis on taking a very strength-based approach to identify with David what coping strategies he already has in place, and perhaps to just change the subject a little, like to welcome him to come in for a cup of tea rather than responding directly to his thoughts and what he's describing, and to find out a bit more about him from his history with services and what supports are already in place, and to explore therefore perhaps what might be helpful in terms of community-based services, not just ED. And then also to don't presume that there is nothing the safe haven can do to provide a benefit to David, again, just because he has a clinical diagnosis, and to be really clear to him as well and transparent in communicating what the service can provide, and that there are other services need to know this, other services in the community. And then in terms of connection to other supports, addressing any of David's clinical needs will be outside the scope of what a peer worker could provide advice on, It does appear that David has other supports, but if not, he may benefit from a more comprehensive clinical assessment that would be done outside the scope of the safe haven and what it can offer. The safe haven could de-escalate, reassure and keep him safe, and then connect him with a caseworker, for example, if he already has one, or the mental health assessment team, if that's required. They could also work potentially in conjunction with the suicide prevention outreach team, who are able to travel to a community and support transition home. Should be possible also to be fast tracked through ED if coming through the safe haven, so a protocol could be developed there, or to call ahead and organise a time for that to happen. And then also to include community-based supports to bring them into the frame of what David could potentially be linked into: GPs, counsellors, community groups, not just crisis-based services. Thanks, Tina. And then in terms of recording and sharing information, if there's not an opportunity to get information from David himself, the safe haven might have access to EMR, but would need to determine appropriate governance around that. So that's something to be further explored. And then sharing information about the range of supports that were available to David, it was recognised could enable a more complementary and collaborative approach through with the safe haven and with David's other supports, if that's done in accordance with his wishes. And just another thing that arose was the idea about when someone comes in that has a diagnosis that's known, talking about medication, that it was a real acknowledgement it's not appropriate for peer workers to be talking to guests about compliance with prescribed medication, particularly that doesn't align with the values of peer work generally, but also the values and principles of a non-clinical service and environment. And so that shouldn't be jumped, that there needs to be an avoidance of jumping into that type of conversation early on, and that through an effective peer-to-peer interaction, someone made the point that this could be a way of David being able to support David to understand his experience of medication, including side effects or any barriers he's experiencing to taking it, which is not about providing advice outside the scope of peer work, but just about sharing lived experience and tips and tricks around what's been effective for them in their own, for peer workers in their own recovery. Thanks, Tina. I'll hand over to you now.
Cool. Thanks, Carrie. I apologise. I'm going to try and position myself in a way that is a bit less affected by the sun. So all of those three scenarios that Carrie just took you through, we looked at all of those before lunch. We had a huge session before lunch. And then these next two scenarios are what we explored after that. So the first one that we looked at after lunch was about Jason, and Jason arrives at the safe haven accompanied by a lady of a similar age who he doesn't introduce. And Jason appears a little agitated with the woman, but seems happy to have arrived safely at the safe space. He accepts a cup of tea from one of the staff, and while he's chatting quietly with them, he keeps glancing towards the woman. It's discovered that she is Jason's sister, and she's really keen to stay with him in the safe haven, and is clearly quite concerned about her brother. So we use this scenario to explore an issue that's really become quite prominent in the discussions that we've had, in particular with people who have lived experience in the Western Sydney area. So that is, how will the safe haven respect the wishes of the guest while also being compassionate about the carer's needs? And given that the primary purpose of the safe haven is to support the person who is in suicidal crisis, what could it offer in the way of support to their carers and their natural supports? So a number of ideas came out of this in terms of the involvement that carers should have in the safe haven and the conversations that take place in the safe haven. It was decided that, or it was suggested that the first thing is to focus on Jason as the guest and to ask him about his support networks, including if he's comfortable talking with his sister being present. So there was a real recognition that Jason perhaps didn't seem completely comfortable with the sister being there, but the sister was very much eager to be involved. it was proposed that a person-centred approach means involving a person's natural support in whatever capacity that the person wants. So it's about what Jason wants. There was recognition that Jason may not have shared all of his story with his sister, and that there could involve other peer workers in the team, that another peer worker may be able to support the sister whilst the first peer worker is responding to Jason and listening to Jason. It was commented that we need to ensure that the service doesn't assume what the relationship is or what the dynamic of a relationship is like, particularly when cultural factors are involved. So, for example, it was raised that we shouldn't assume that somebody who's referred to as a sister is a blood relative of the person. That we may need to establish boundaries in order to keep both Jason comfortable and his sister comfortable. And we also need to be really aware that the language or concept of carer may not be something that really fits or resonates with the guest. So Jason may not recognise his sister as his carer, but also Jason's sister may not consider herself a carer. So we need to be really careful about the way we use that word. There was also recognition that the decisions made in the safe haven could potentially complicate the ongoing relationship between the guest and their carer. So, that Jason will need to have an ongoing, or may wish to have an ongoing relationship with his sister. And so people need to be mindful of that. But also in terms of whether Jason wants to go home with his sister, and that was a particularly important thing to consider. So that was all about the involvement that carers should have in the safe haven. There was also a lot of conversation around the sorts of supports that should be offered to carers. There was general agreement that the safe haven needs to be a safe place for carers too. That we need to recognise that the sister has played some role in getting Jason to the service, and she's probably found the last few hours pretty tough. Jason's sister is likely to need to feel or have the opportunity to recharge. And when they leave the space, she's going to have the need for rest and for recharge as well. And so she needs to be provided the right kind of support for that. The safe haven needs to provide a welcoming symbol of comfort for carers. So, for example, offering them a cup of tea. One person suggested setting up a carers corner in the safe haven, and there are a number of people that were quite excited about that as an idea, that there actually be a set space in the safe haven where carers can go and get some information and calm and soothe themselves. And other comments on not making assumptions about who needs support in the relationship, that perhaps Jason's sister is there because she also requires support. And the blue sky thinking was around the possibility of a dedicated carer peer worker. There is recognition that there could be conflict with losing focus on the primary role of the safe haven, which is providing support to people in suicidal crisis. But there was definitely the idea that in the ideal world, we would have carer peer workers there as well. So the big complicated issue that came out of Jason's scenario was this idea of consent and, working out what Jason wants. So it was suggested that we can hear both Jason and his sister, and that there's no need to tell the other what has been shared. And that unless Jason indicates he wants his sister to be involved, that there really should not be any involvement of the sister in what's happening. They said it was suggested that if there is tension, we may need to have some ability to create space between Jason and the sister while Jason is receiving support in the safe haven, so perhaps separate rooms. If the peer worker is going to share information with Jason's sister, it was pretty much agreed that Jason's consent needs to be gained first. And that if he's agitated but consents to her being involved, the peer worker could play a role in creating the opportunity for Jason to share his concerns and what he's agitated about. One participant in the co-design session did say that the New South Wales Mental Health Act provides a really helpful template that can be used for the sharing of information between a person and any other person, such as guardians, friends, and family. So that was Jason's scenario. And we looked at one other scenario during the session, and that was about Amanda. So Amanda is a 20-year-old woman with a history of past suicide attempts who comes to the safe haven extremely distressed. She says that her life is not worth living and that she has tried everything to stop feeling this way. She tells the SP peer worker that she has been on dozens of different medications, tried therapy for childhood trauma, done everything her psychologist has told her. Nothing ever works, and she has run out of options. When the worker asks her if she has plans to kill herself, she tells them that she has the means and is just waiting for her mum and dad to leave her alone. Her history of past attempts is known to one of the safe haven peer workers who had previously supported her in the emergency department. So the key questions for Amanda's scenario were that given the ministry requirements that a safe haven provide non-clinical, risk-tolerant, person-centred care, how will the local safe haven support guests who are at imminent risk? Also, how will the suicide prevention peer workers work to ensure the safety of guests at high risk in ways that align with peer work values and principles and the locally identified safe haven values and principles? And what are some of the ways that the suicide prevention peer workers can be supported to provide safe and effective support to guests at high risk of suicide? So there were three key themes that came out of our discussion around Amanda's situation. And the first was around this idea of providing non-clinical support. So it was acknowledged that people made it quite clear that they felt we should acknowledge it's good that Amanda has arrived at the safe haven, that it's a sign of strength, and we really need to validate her feelings. That acknowledging there was an acknowledgement that clinical interventions haven't worked for Amanda in the past, and we need to acknowledge that that's the way Amanda feels about it. And that Amanda has really lost trust in these clinical approaches. So it was suggested that this is a real opportunity to educate Amanda about what a peer worker is and what peer support can do, what it looks like, and how it's different to clinical services. It was thought that perhaps explaining that peer support and maybe exploring some other non-clinical options, that it would be possible to flip Amanda's perspective that nothing works. It was suggested that we should recognise that while Amanda is in the safe haven, she is safe and she is not at risk. And that means that having her come to the safe haven, it provides an opportunity for a shift in her thinking and her desire to end her life and to actually create safety around her. So I guess the real theme that came out was rather than be distracted by the risk, to rather really focus on the opportunity that Amanda is safe while she's here in the safe haven, that this is a chance to have conversations, this is an opportunity for change. It was commented on the ability of peer workers to use purposeful storytelling from a perspective of hope to really bridge that gap, create a sense of difference from past clinical services that haven't worked for Amanda. Now, having recognised it, and there was general support in the conversation for providing Amanda non-clinical support, there was also a lot of comments about prioritising Amanda's safety. So it was suggested that we have a conversation with Amanda about the means that she is referring to, to ask if she's able to take that means away, or whether there's some other way of creating safety that reduces access to that means. It was suggested that non-verbal cues between peer workers could be used to indicate to other staff in the safe haven that the person that the peer worker is speaking to is seen as being at high risk. It was recognised that once Amanda leaves the safe space, Amanda may have access to the means. So perhaps it's appropriate to involve the SPOT team if they're mobile. And the SPOT team could then complete safety planning with her in her home where the means has been located. There was discussion about other agencies, such as the police, being involved to remove means. And it was recognised that safe havens are still needed to provide safety and comfort for people that go there. One idea was that we could identify the role of the parents and whether they're a source of support and whether they can be involved at all. And that it'd be perhaps necessary to notify them if their safety is in some way comprised, and that could be done without breaching confidentiality. The last theme that really emerged for Amanda's situation was around conversation around connection to other services. So it was recognised that this scenario is what the safe haven is for. So not referring Amanda immediately to the emergency department is really important. And that it's also really important that we don't see Amanda's situation as out of scope of peer workers. Instead, we need to see what the service can offer people like Amanda. That even if Amanda went to the emergency department, she may not be admitted. And that the ED should be used as a last resort after everything the safe haven has done. The safe haven does everything it's capable of doing. And if after doing what the safe haven can do, people feel there's still needs that Amanda has that have not been met, that's when you then take extra steps to make sure that those needs are met. It was suggested that a clinical intervention might be of benefit, that a trauma history indicates that there could be some clinical needs that are outside peer work, and that there also needs to be some tolerance around risk, and that when and where a peer worker may eventually contact the emergency services to intervene, well, that needs to be in that context of risk tolerance. Some guidance for escalation should be provided for the peer workers, and it should be documented because each worker's risk perception or tolerance may vary. And if the peer worker does not feel comfortable around the level of risk, they need to be supported to reach out and seek advice or to receive support from other services such as the support team, the emergency department, the acute care team, or the police. If building rapport with the person, it was pointed out that suggesting you're going to bring someone else in, that you may need to actually say that you're going to be there to support them through that process. So that when another service comes to be involved, or when the emergency department is involved, that there needs to be a peer worker who can be with the person and support them through that whole time.
Thanks, Tina. That's a lot of information. We appreciate that it is. And so it's embedded in the survey that we're just about to tell you again, that we want you to complete and certainly to spread to your networks. And that's where you can provide more in-depth feedback, particularly if you're someone that hasn't participated directly in the co-design sessions. One of the things that we will want to hear from you about are what are the I want to know what the sort of the core values of the local safe haven are that will guide the way it operates. And just a reminder again here, these are the general ones that are provided that were developed through a statewide co-design forum that kicked off this initiative by the Ministry of Health. I won't go through them now, they'll be in the survey. These are the ones that came out of the local process though: privacy and confidentiality, respect, empathy, compassion, choice, nurturing and supportive, safety, listening, authenticity, transparency, reliability, timeliness, non-discriminatory, human connection, collaboration, cultural competency, and autonomy. So we would like feedback survey respondents to indicate and prioritise which values should end up on the sort of the short list, the core values for your local safe haven. I think you can see from hearing about the outputs from that combined session that it's something that health professionals are also telling us locally, that these are the sort of values and principles that they believe should be guiding your local safe haven. Thanks, Tina. Then we didn't get to principles or non-negotiables, which we typically do in those combined sessions, because there was such rich, productive conversation in the room around the scenarios. So because we didn't have time to discuss in that combined session, we would welcome contributions and suggestions for a set of guiding principles for the safe haven locally. And then also, thanks, Tina. And then we didn't have time to discuss these sort of the top, say, 4 or 5 non-negotiables for the local safe haven, but we'd also again welcome contributions and suggestions in the survey responses. Thank you, Tina. So that's really a wrap for in terms of communicating the outputs from the direct process and the feedback loops. The next steps is that the survey will be live now, from now and for 3 weeks. The final collation of all co-design outputs will be shared with participants after the feedback survey closes. We know it's super important for people that participate in co-design and share their expertise, their wisdom, their insights so generously that they don't then suddenly feel, well, where's that all gone? There is a commitment to the iterative nature of co-design to keep people, participants, in the loop. Those co-design outputs will then be handed over to Western Sydney LHD for implementation in the form of a report from Beacon Strategies, who has provided sort of back-end support for this process. Thanks, Tina. We can come back to full screen. We just want to thank everyone, particularly the people with lived experience and health professionals that were so generous with their time, their contribution. We're sharing sometimes, you know, deeply personal experiences, not just lived experience participants, but health professionals, and all doing it in order to create a more compassionate system and services and supports for their local community. So it's deeply appreciated. We really do emphasise that you need to spread the word about this service to promote it in the community. It's a communities based service, and it's there for the community, and to also to encourage people to complete that survey so we hear from as many people as possible in this process. Thank you to everyone again for all your contributions. Tina.
Yes, thank you. It's really been a privilege to be involved in these conversations, and both Carrie and myself are really excited about what's happening with the setting up of the safe haven in Western Sydney. So I'm going to say thank you, and Carrie.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and have a great evening.